In the 1800s, the mighty British Empire had a massive, crippling addiction. Not to power, not to gold, but to hot leaf juice. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was the lifeblood of the British economy. The average citizen was consuming pounds of it every single year. But there was one massive, humiliating problem for the world's biggest superpower. They didn't know how to grow a single tea plant. Every single leaf of tea had to be bought from one place and one place only: the highly secretive, tightly controlled Qing Dynasty of China. And the Chinese emperor had a very strict policy when dealing with the British. We don't want your cheap manufactured goods. If you want our precious tea, you pay in cold, hard, solid silver. And the British East India Company was bleeding silver fast. The East India Company was the most powerful corporation in history, with its own private army. Yet they were going broke over afternoon tea. By the 1830s, the trade deficit was so bad that Britain was literally running out of silver. The national treasury was ringing empty. So, the empire came up with a highly unethical solution. If China only wanted silver, Britain would force them to want something else. They turned to their vast colonies in India and started growing fields upon fields of poppy plants to produce cheap, highly addictive opium. The British essentially became the world's largest drug cartel, smuggling opium into China to illegally trade it for silver to buy more tea. This ruthless strategy triggered the infamous Opium Wars. British gunboats bombarded Chinese coastal cities, forcing the Qing Dynasty to open their ports. But even with military victory, the East India Company realized something terrifying. They were still completely dependent on Chinese farmers for their tea supply. What if China stopped producing? What if the supply chain collapsed? The entire British economy would crash into absolute ruin. They needed their own tea industry in India. But the Chinese guarded the secrets of tea cultivation tighter than their military fortresses. To pull off the greatest corporate heist in history, the East India Company didn't send a legendary military general or a highly trained assassin. They sent a 35-year-old Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune, a man whose greatest passion in life was looking at nice flowers. His top-secret mission? Infiltrate the Forbidden Mountains of China, steal thousands of the finest tea seeds, and learn exactly how the leaves were processed. There was just one tiny catch. Foreigners were strictly banned from traveling into the Chinese interior. If caught, he could be imprisoned, or worse. So Fortune devised a plan. He would use the most unconvincing, desperate disguise in the history of espionage. He shaved the front of his head with a blunt razor and awkwardly sewed a fake braided pigtail onto the back of his hair. He put on the heavy robes of a Chinese merchant, which barely fit his tall Scottish frame. He even gave himself a completely believable local name, Xinghua, which roughly translates to the bright flower. To explain why he was a foot taller than everyone else and spoke broken Chinese, he claimed he was simply an official from a distant province beyond the Great Wall. Miraculously, it worked. Or, more likely, his hired local guides just didn't care as long as he kept paying them in silver. Disguise secured, Fortune and his heavily bribed entourage boarded a small wooden junk boat and headed deep into the uncharted Chinese river systems. The journey was not a pleasant river cruise. They faced violent storms, treacherous rapids, and a much deadlier threat. At one point, heavily armed river pirates attacked their ship. Fortune, suffering from a fever, dragged himself onto the deck and fought them off, with a shotgun and an umbrella. Finally, after weeks of dodging authorities and surviving the wild, the mist cleared. They had arrived at the legendary Wuyi Mountains. This was the heavily guarded heart of China's tea empire, and Robert Fortune was about to rob them blind. Fortune snuck into the processing factories, where he immediately solved one of Europe's greatest botanical mysteries. For centuries, European scientists had violently debated whether black tea and green tea came from two completely different plant species. Fortune discovered the shocking truth. They were the exact same plant. Mind blown. The difference was entirely in the processing. Green tea was roasted immediately, while black tea was left out to oxidize and ferment. He secretly documented every single step of this ancient manufacturing technique in his tiny notebook. But as he ventured deeper into the factories producing export tea specifically for the British market, he witnessed something that made his blood run cold. Workers were dumping a strange, bright blue industrial powder into the roasting tea. Upon closer inspection, he realized the mixture was Prussian blue, a cyanide-based compound, and gypsum. They were literally dyeing the export tea with poison. But why? Because British consumers falsely believed that high-quality green tea had to look vividly, unnaturally green. Pure ignorance. To meet this foreign demand, Chinese merchants just accommodated them. The British elite had been proudly poisoning themselves for decades. Fortune pocketed the toxic samples as ultimate proof. But industrial espionage wasn't enough. He needed the biological assets. He needed the actual seeds and the highest quality tea seedlings in the entire empire. Under the cover of darkness, disguised as a merchant, he uprooted thousands of premium plants right out from under the guards' noses. He had the treasure. Now, he just had to transport thousands of delicate, living plants halfway across the globe. A sea journey where almost everything usually died. Historically, transporting plants on a ship took months. The salt air, extreme temperatures, and lack of fresh water meant 90% of botanical specimens simply died. But fortune had a secret weapon, the Wardian case, a revolutionary new invention that functioned as a miniature portable greenhouse. It created a completely sealed ecosystem. Moisture from the soil would evaporate, condense on the glass, and rain back down. It literally watered itself. Fortune didn't just pack plants. He planted thousands of fragile tea seeds directly into the dirt inside these glass boxes, allowing them to germinate during the voyage. He secretly loaded these fragile glass terrariums onto East India Company ships bound for the British colony of India. For months, the ships braved the treacherous oceans. The British Empire's entire economic future rested inside a few boxes of dirt. While storms raged and sailors suffered outside, the tea plants sat comfortably inside their little glass resorts, perfectly hydrated and totally oblivious. When the cases finally arrived in Calcutta, British botanists eagerly pried them open, expecting to find nothing but dead twigs. Instead, they found over 20,000 healthy, sprouted tea seedlings. It was a botanical miracle. But India's lowlands are incredibly hot. To make the delicate Chinese tea thrive, they had to move the plants to freezing altitudes, specifically to the steep, misty hills of Darjeeling and Assam. The climate was a perfect match for the Chinese mountains. The British immediately began clearing land, planting the stolen Chinese bushes into Indian soil and building massive plantations. But fortune knew that having the plant wasn't enough. Making tea is an art. So, he committed his final act of corporate espionage. He smuggled a group of elite Chinese tea masters out of the country to teach the British and Indian workers exactly how to process the leaves. The ultimate heist was complete. The seeds were planted, the experts were secured, and the British Empire was about to change the global economy forever. But the British didn't just copy the Chinese method. They industrialized it. They applied the ruthless efficiency of the Industrial Revolution to agriculture. Instead of small family farms scattered across mountains, the East India Company built massive, highly disciplined plantations worked by thousands of local laborers. Output exploded. Trains and steamships were loaded with mountains of British-grown Indian tea ready to flood the global market. But there was one final hurdle. British consumers still vastly preferred Chinese tea. They considered Indian tea to be a cheap knockoff. So, the empire launched one of the most successful smear campaigns in advertising history using Robert Fortune's most disturbing discovery. They loudly publicized that Chinese merchants were artificially dyeing their tea with Prussian blue cyanide to fool the British public. The British public was utterly horrified. They had been drinking literal poison for years. Indian tea, the empire proudly announced, was grown by British gentlemen using modern science, completely pure and free of toxic chemicals. The impact on global trade was apocalyptic. In just a few decades, the market completely flipped. China's tea exports, which once controlled 90% of the world's supply, collapsed to almost nothing. The silver stopped flowing in. Britain had achieved the ultimate economic checkmate. They now controlled both the supply of opium going into China and the supply of tea going out of India. And that is the deeply ironic legacy of the polite, civilized British afternoon tea. A cultural symbol of refinement and high society built entirely on corporate espionage, international smuggling, and state-sponsored drug cartels. As for Robert Fortune, he returned to Britain a very wealthy man, wrote a few popular books about his travels, and quietly went back to doing what he loved most, looking at nice flowers, blissfully unaware that he had just single-handedly redrawn the map of the global economy. The Great Tea Heist proved a terrifying new concept for the British Empire. Whoever controls the plants controls the world. Kew Gardens in London wasn't just a pretty public park. It became the biological war room of the empire. It acted as a global clearinghouse for stolen botanical goods. And they soon had their eyes on another monopoly. As the British expanded their empire into tropical regions, they hit a microscopic brick wall: malaria. Their soldiers were dying by the thousands. The only known cure was quinine, extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree, found exclusively in the Andes Mountains of South America. And just like China with tea, countries like Peru and Bolivia held a strict monopoly, fiercely guarding their seeds to keep prices astronomical. But the British had already mastered the art of the botanical heist. They simply snuck in and took them. Using Wardian cases again, they smuggled the seeds to India and Ceylon, creating massive cinchona plantations. The malaria cure was now in British hands. With a steady supply of quinine, often mixed with gin to mask the bitter taste, British troops could survive the deepest jungles. The scramble for Africa had officially begun. Decades later, the empire set its sights on a new prize, deep within the Amazon rainforest of Brazil. The Industrial Revolution was roaring, and factories desperately needed one specific material for belts, gaskets, and tires: rubber. Brazil controlled the entire global supply of natural rubber, making absolute fortunes and building opera houses in the middle of the jungle. Enter Henry Wickham, a British adventurer who managed to collect over 70,000 rubber tree seeds and sneak them onto a chartered steamship. He slipped past Brazilian customs by calmly claiming he was transporting highly delicate botanical specimens for Queen Victoria herself. The seeds were grown at Kew and shipped to Malaya. Within years, the British completely dominated the rubber trade, and the Brazilian rubber boom collapsed overnight. By the late 19th century, the British had perfected a new kind of warfare: botanical imperialism. They realized that to truly conquer a nation, you don't always need armies or cannons. Sometimes, a single stolen seed is infinitely more dangerous. The empire treated the Earth's biosphere like a giant chessboard, moving entire ecosystems from one continent to another just to maximize profit. But these massive new plantations in India, Ceylon, and Malaya created a massive new problem. Who was going to do the grueling, back-breaking work to harvest it all? With slavery recently abolished, the British invented a loophole: the indentured labor system. They didn't just move plants, they moved millions of people. Impoverished workers from India and China were shipped across oceans, bound by strict contracts, to sweat and bleed in these new artificial jungles. The ecological cost was equally catastrophic. Ancient, diverse, and vibrant rainforests were brutally chopped down and burned to ash. They were replaced by millions of identical clones. Rubber trees in Malaya, tea bushes in Assam, endless, silent, unnatural monocultures. Nature had been tamed, packaged, and turned into a highly profitable spreadsheet for the East India Company and the British Crown. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, in the damp, gloomy streets of London, none of this brutal reality mattered. The British elite enjoyed their smooth carriage rides on Amazonian rubber tires, sipping Indian tea sweetened with Caribbean sugar. A polite, highly civilized culture built precisely on the back of global botanical theft and mass exploitation. By stealing these plants, Britain broke the ancient monopolies of Asia and South America, becoming the undisputed hyperpower of the 19th century. They didn't just redraw political borders, they physically terraformed the planet. They rearranged nature itself to serve the crown. So the next time you sit down to enjoy a quiet, relaxing cup of tea, when we look back at the mighty British Empire, we usually think of their unmatched navy, their disciplined redcoat armies, and their industrial might. But the real architects of their global dominance weren't just generals or politicians. They were nerdy, plant-obsessed botanists, men armed with nothing but magnifying glasses, Wardian cases, and an absolute disregard for international borders. Robert Fortune's theft of Chinese tea wasn't just a single crime. It was the master blueprint for an entire era of botanical imperialism. It proved a terrifying reality. If you can steal the root of a nation's wealth, you can uproot the nation itself. The Qing Dynasty, stripped of its greatest economic weapon and flooded with British opium, spiraled into a devastating century of decline and chaos. While Britain, fueled by Indian tea, Amazonian rubber, and Andean medicine, built a modern world order that favored them and them alone. Today, tea is the second most consumed beverage on Earth, right after water. And names like English breakfast or Earl Grey feel like timeless, innocent, and perfectly civilized British traditions. But inside every warm, comforting cup steeps a dark, aggressive history. A history of addiction, smuggling, monopoly, and the most audacious corporate heist the world has ever seen. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous weapon an empire can wield is a simple little leaf. Thanks for watching Crown and Colony.